So, welcome again, dear wonderful speakers, for having found time for today's discussion. My name is Eka. Once again, I'm the program director of the Platform Peace and Humanities program. This is a program for Southeast Europe and Black Sea region. Welcome to this platform. Hello, everyone who is watching us and who is going to watch us later, because this video is going to be is being recorded, and I'm sure that we will have today very interesting discussion. This is about conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, and this is very difficult, very sensitive and deep-rooted conflict, which has been going on over decades. And the eruption of this conflict, with the possible results of casualties and all other negative aspects, it's always just a matter of time. Before going to start this actual discussion, I'm going to give a brief overview of this conflict to our audience who is watching us today, like in a nutshell, how it started and how it went up until now. So Nagorno-Karabakh is in the South Caucasus region and historically is populated by mostly Armenians. During the Soviet time, it was placed under the Azerbaijani control. This territory since then officially is recognized as the territory of Azerbaijan. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Armenians tried to regain control over the territory and several surrounding territories. The war resulted in significant casualties and de facto Armenian-controlled government. After years of frozen conflict, the war erupted in 2016 between Armenia and Azerbaijan, with yet another series of casualties on both sides. In 2020, the development of the conflict occurred when Azerbaijani forces launched military actions to regain control of the contested land. After several weeks of intense fighting, a ceasefire agreement was signed. After the 2020 ceasefire agreement, in 2022 September, a two-day conflict resulted in 100 to 300 killed and the cross-border attacks. In December 2022, Azerbaijan occupied the Lachin corridor, severely restricting movement to and from the breakaway republic. On September 19, 2023, Azerbaijan launched a so-called anti-terrorist offensive in Nagorno-Karabakh, which resulted in the killings of at least 200 people. Within 2 days, the Armenian side surrendered. And after several peace talks in 2023, the Armenian leader, Armenian President Pashinyan, declared that the Armenian government recognizes the entire Nagorno-Karabakh region as the sovereign territory of Azerbaijan and called on Azerbaijan to respect and acknowledge internationally recognized territorial boundaries and guarantee rights for the Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh. Most recently, on October 3, the Armenian parliament voted to join the International Criminal Court. The conflict has had severe humanitarian consequences, including the displacement of thousands of people, the destruction of infrastructure, the casualties among civilians. So we're going to talk about several aspects of the conflict today, which is self-determination and sovereignty, international legal consequences in terms of potential criminal liability for the committed war crimes, human rights violations, and the avenue for peace resolution. So we have wonderful, brilliant speakers today. Oh, Sheila is here. Hello, Sheila. Welcome, welcome. I'm very happy to see you. Can you hear me? Can we hear you? Say hello, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, that was very stressful, but I made it. I'm so happy I made it.
And we are all so happy as well. So we are now going to proceed to our speakers. The first speaker is Sheila Paylan. Let me introduce Sheila. She is international human rights lawyer and former legal advisor to the UN for more than 15 years. She's going to talk about the historical background and the root cause of this conflict. Sheila previously served as a pro bono advisor to the Republic of Armenia in the aftermath of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, including during the submission of Armenia's first request for provisional measures against Azerbaijan before the International Court of Justice in 2021. So we are very curious and we're very happy to hear now your point of view, Sheila. So yeah, floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to speak about this often overlooked part of the conflict. The context of Karabakh, of the conflict, is of course closely tied to the region's complex history, which is often simplified. But if I could simplify it, it's really a desire for and a struggle for independence and self-determination, predominantly by the Armenian population of that region. And Azerbaijan, in turn, sees that struggle for independence, understandably so, as a threat to their sovereignty and territorial integrity. So when we speak of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we usually start the clock at 1988, when full-blown armed conflict broke out. And it's true that most Armenians and Azerbaijanis had pretty much good relations before 1988. But the disputes over the region really date back to the beginning of the 20th century. And I mean, in fact, Armenians have had a continuous majority presence in Nagorno-Karabakh for at least like 2,000 years, but I only have 10 minutes, so I won't go back that far. The modern history of both Armenians and Azerbaijanis has more than enough like real instances of catastrophe and loss to provide more than enough grounds for root causes and for this conflict. I'll go back to the Treaty of Turkmenchai that divided Azerbaijan into two, Russian and Iranian parts, and the great power politics of 1915 to 1921 that truncated Armenia. And while the Armenian genocide of 1915 in Turkish Anatolia pretty much sort of like eclipses any major other sort of catastrophe that happened in the neighborhood in modern history, we can't ignore that Azerbaijanis also suffered grievously from the early 20th century on. So with the fall of the Russian and Ottoman empires came these really messy attempts by Armenians and Azerbaijanis to draw borders and build these viable independent states like around 1917 to 1920. And it was the same bloody process that was being played out in most of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. It was also a war by proxy. I mean, a lot of that looks a lot like what's going on right now with Russia and Turkey continuing a long-running territorial conflict, using the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis as their sort of local allies for this proxy war. But the problem, or the problem is that Karabakh was always caught right in the middle of that. Geographically, it's sort of situated on the Azerbaijani side of this mountain range that runs between the two countries. Demographically, it was mixed, but always very predominantly Armenian, and therefore of extreme religious and cultural significance to Armenians, who at that time had just been wiped out of their historic homeland in Eastern Anatolia. Now, by 1921, Soviet authorities came into control over Nagorno-Karabakh, and in July of 1921, Joseph Stalin ruled that the mountainous part of Karabakh would be part of Soviet Azerbaijan. So he created this Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast with borders within the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan that gave it a very like a 94% population of Armenians within the borders of Azerbaijan. And this decision, which Armenians really view as unfair and arbitrary, has been the source of contention and probably the most significant root cause of the conflict ever since. So from then on until 1988, under Soviet rule, the region kept a very large degree of autonomy as an oblast, an autonomous oblast, which partly explains why relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis were relatively good, but not without, of course, simmering tension. And this arrangement turned the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast into one of only 2 instances in the Soviet system where you had like this autonomous type of entity within one Union Republic that had a very strong affiliation to another Union Republic and a neighboring one at that. The other instance is the Russian majority Crimea situation. And so the contradictions, like this arrangement created this simmering tension over the years. It was never really openly discussed, but these 2 separate narratives formed. And many Armenians never, like I said, accepted this decision by Stalin because it was not fair. And there were protests throughout Soviet rule until 1988. In February, the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast voted to basically separate, and they wanted to join Armenia. So they requested Soviet government in Moscow to permit Karabakh to leave Soviet Azerbaijan and become part of Soviet Armenia. This vote takes Soviet Azerbaijan by surprise, and this is where the violence really takes off. It starts with, there were these Sumgait pogroms, like just 1 week after that vote, when mobs of ethnic Azerbaijanis formed into groups and attacked and killed Armenians on the streets in their apartments for 3 days in the town of Sumgait, which is just like 30 kilometers outside of Baku. And this pogrom effectively turned the Karabakh dispute into the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or like the beginning of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. Another moment comes in January 1990, where a 7-day pogrom breaks out in Baku against the Armenian civilian population. Armenians are beaten, murdered, expelled from the city. Then in 1991, Nagorno-Karabakh really declares independence from Azerbaijan and forms the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, which is not recognized by the international community, but they take this act, and there's sort of there's legislation that could be said to have permitted the act. The end of the Soviet Union coincides with that, obviously. In 1991, transforms the conflict, now 2 years, from a civil war to an international armed conflict, because newly independent Armenia enters the theater of war to support Nagorno-Karabakh. So that simplification to say that this is just a territorial dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan is, there are so many other layers and textures to that. It's not quite that. The conflict continues until 1994. A ceasefire is brokered by Russia. It effectively leaves Nagorno-Karabakh as a self-declared independent entity for the next 30 years, almost 30 years, 26 years. Over that period of time, Nagorno-Karabakh seeks international recognition as an independent state. The international community, as we all know, doesn't love these kinds of situations. Separatist movements are not very popular. So they generally support the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, but call for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And I know that, Eka, you've already sort of, I'll just to wrap it up, so because I feel like I can't stop right there. In September 2020,
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Azerbaijan, launches a full-scale armed attack in a purported frustration over these peace negotiations not leading anywhere, and saying we're just going to take it back. So 44 days, thousands of deaths later, a ceasefire is brokered again by Russia in November 2020. And after 3 years, last month, Azerbaijan attacked to reclaim what was left of Nagorno-Karabakh after having kept the region under blockade for 9 months, really slowly starving its indigenous Armenian population into submission. That episode lasted only 24 hours, after which Nagorno-Karabakh authorities surrendered. And within days, more than 100,000 Armenians fled Nagorno-Karabakh into neighboring Armenia. The population was estimated at roughly 120,000 prior to the takeover. But when we count all the deaths that ensued from the war and the blockade, and so, I mean, now the UN has estimated there are only about 50 Armenians left, maybe up to 1,000. The numbers are that low of Armenians left in Nagorno-Karabakh, which therefore has effectively been ethnically cleansed of its indigenous Armenian population.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll get back to you. So I just want to tell you, dear wonderful speakers, that after listening to all of you, we'll have questions. And I hope that we'll have time for that. So thank you again, Sheila, for this. Now I want to give the floor to Royshin. Right? I mean, pronunciation is correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes. I want to. Yes, Royshin, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to use a first slide in case people are not familiar with the region, would like to see a map, if I can find it there quickly. Yes.
Yeah. So you're going to have the PowerPoint presentation, and you're welcome for this. I just want to give a brief introduction to our speaker, Dr. Royshin Burke. She's Assistant Professor of Public International Law, Netherlands Institute of Human Rights, Utrecht University. So Royshin is going to talk about the sovereignty and self-determination. She's been working on this conflict from a legal perspective with the focus on self-determination and has published a number of times on this particular issue. Welcome again. We are very interested in what you have to say. Royshin, please.
Thank you. The slide doesn't appear to be working for some reason. It doesn't seem to be uploading. So I'm just going to go ahead and talk if that's okay. So just to start, I'm just going to build off what Sheila was speaking about and yourself, Ika. So, I mean, Nagorno-Karabakh has a very, I think, sad history of a population that has suffered for many years from the brunt of conflict, geopolitical power plays, and human rights violations. I think today the past has really engraved itself on the landscape, which is littered with monuments, abandoned army tanks mounted with portraits of dead soldiers, half abandoned or now abandoned villages. Currently, many states and powers have strategic and natural resource interests in the region, not least in relation to the Sunni province, which contains the so-called Zangezur corridor, effectively the border between Armenia and Iran. Today, Nagorno-Karabakh is internationally regarded as legally a part of Azerbaijan. You've been already, the history has been very, very well framed of the period. Aspects of that. What I'm going to touch on are terms of territorial integrity and self-determination. National law have court this dispute over recent years. Now, I have to say that to talk about self-determination in light of the mass exodus to exercise Nagorno-Karabakh has by Armenians and Azerbaijanis for the past 100 years. In the literature, one-sided views are often presented of human rights violations occurring during and due to the conflict over the years. We know that Nagorno-Karabakh was controversially placed within the administrative territory and throughout the Soviet period, the Karabakh suppressed. In the 90s, as we know, there were several episodes of mob violence across Azerbaijan, and that the economic status of Nagorno-Karabakh was repealed in 1991. Now, Nagorno-Karabakh referendum, which was boycotted by the Azeri minority, and in 1992 it declared itself in an independent state from Azerbaijan. It hasn't been recognized as such by any state internationally. A devastating conflict ensued, which saw many human rights violations and extensive displacement of people on both sides of the conflict. Now, for over 3 decades, Nagorno-Karabakh has acted as a de facto state. I'm not going to defining statehood. It should be noted, however, that it hasn't been recognised by any country at this state. The Helsinki Final Act of 1975 set out some core principles for preventing and resolving conflict between states, namely the need for respect for self-determination of peoples, state territorial integrity, and the non-use of force against another state or threat thereof, including to acquire territory. These principles are not easy bedfellows. The protection of territorial integrity of states from the use of force by another state or threat thereof is set out in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. It's in international law called hostilities, and it's a rather arbitrary principle, and it's linked to the process of decolonization. It basically stated that newly formed states must accept the boundaries left to them by colonial powers. And the principle has long been applied outside the decolonization context. Its application means Nagorno-Karabakh had to accept the boundaries inherited by it at the collapse of the USSR. However, there is increasingly an argument that the territorial integrity of existing states is not absolute, and external self-determination might be possible under international law in very limited and extreme cases, where oppression of a people by the parent state is so egregious that internal self-determination will not provide a solution. This is referred to as remedial secession, a concept that there's growing recognition of, or at least toleration of, in international law. Now, self-determination revolves around the collective right of people, and it's set out in numerous international legal instruments. I think we could all agree that the Karabakh Armenians constitute a people. They identify as such. They have a common ethnic identity. They have a historical, centuries-old connection with Nagorno-Karabakh's territory. They have a common identity, language, and religion, which is distinct from the rest of the Azerbaijani population. But it does not mean they did not coexist with the Azeri population in the Nagorno-Karabakh for centuries. Now, the preferred manner in which self-determination can be exercised by a people is internally, wherein a state is enabled to a group is enabled to exercise varying levels of autonomy within the existing state structure. For instance, related to selected policy areas or governance issues, and with varying levels of oversight centrally. States are required under numerous international and legal instruments to protect the rights of all groups in a state, including the protection of minorities. And it's in this, as stated by the UN Secretary General in 1992, and he's an agenda for peace, that we find a balance between the principles of territorial integrity and the right to self-determination. Now, in a Canadian case called the Reference Resecession of Quebec, the court recognised that external self-determination, which includes possible unilateral secession, might be exercisable in these extreme cases where a group constitute a people, have historical linkages to territory, and gross human rights violations being perpetrated against them. But it arises, the court says, as a very last resort where they cannot exercise self-determination meaningfully internally. Now, we saw arguments in relation to this concept of remedial secession made in the context of Kosovo's independence from Serbia on the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia without the latter's consent. However, where you lend more foreign military assistance to such movements, it'll generally undermine any legal claim to remedial secession. There is a prohibition in international law on such a use of force by other states. Now, this doesn't apply to people within a state, but applies to other states. Moreover, even external interventions on humanitarian grounds have at least been implicitly condoned on occasion. Now, the Declaration of Friendly Relations of 1970 prohibits interfering with the territorial integrity of states conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Arguably, failure to do so might give rise to a claim of remedial secession. Now, we saw this, as I said, in relation to Kosovo. However, there is a refusal by the international community in most occasions to weigh the balance in favour of self-determination of peoples over that of territorial integrity of states. The notion of remedial secession remains very controversial, but it is evolving and its advocates are increasing. Kosovo unilaterally declared its independence from Serbia in 2008, following a period of extreme inter-ethnic violence between 1998 and 2000. A question regarding the legality of that declaration of independence went to the International Court of Justice. Remedial secession was referred to by a number of states in their interventions. However, the ICJ avoided dealing with the concept substantively, but it did state that the unilateral declaration was not prohibited under international law. Moreover, it in effect delinked the unlawful use of force, i.e. NATO's bombings, from the unilateral declaration of independence, but it did not explain why. This delinking was possibly due to the retrospective authorization of the presence of NATO by the UN Security Council. In that case, in a separate opinion, Judge Trinidad observed that no state can use territory to destroy the population. Such atrocities amount to an absurd reversal of the ends of the state, which was created and exists for human beings and not vice versa. Many states now today accept Kosovo as a state. I think there's a real fear among states or the international community of movements seeking secession, often in the face of artificially constructed state boundaries, dividing ethnic groups. I think this is very vivid in the former Soviet states. Armenians residing in Soviet times in Nagorno-Karabakh accuse Azerbaijan of social, economic, cultural, and political repression, deliberate economic underdevelopment, and deliberate alteration of the ethnic makeup of the enclave. They claim that this was coupled by the pogroms in various Azerbaijani cities and the state's failure to intervene in these. And they also talk about the revocation of the autonomy that Nagorno-Karabakh held in relation to internal self-determination. Now we had the blockade of the Lachian corridor and some horrific human rights violations that occurred during the 2020 conflict and shortly thereafter. Now, coupled with the events, I think, of the last few weeks, which arguably some would say amounted to ethnic cleansing, with over 100,000 ethnic Armenians fleeing their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh, there might be some credence to remedial secession claims. Ironically, the threshold might now have been met, but the time has gone as people have left. Now, past use of force by Armenia, however, undermines remedial secession claims. However, in 2023, there was no Armenian state use of force. I think the question for us in the international community is, what are we trying to protect under international law? What takes precedence, the human rights of people or the rights of states? While international law provides us with some legal principles, it seems the balance has long tipped in favour of states and territorial integrity. There is, however, some growing recognition of the concept of remedial secession. For now, apart from Kosovo, it seems a bit of a toothless baby, but petite and babies do grow. Now, international law fails to protect the ethnic minority in Azerbaijan, favouring the state. Whether the Karabakh Armenians continue to fight for return to their home and some form of internal self-determination is anyone's guess, but I suspect that most won't return. At very least, until there are very genuine guarantees from Azerbaijan that their rights and security will be protected, there will be a countering of hate speech, and that there's a peace operation presence on the ground. I'll leave that with you.
Mm-hmm. Version?
That's it from me.
So, yeah, that was kind of frozen voice. So, would you like to add something more to your very interesting speech?
No, that's it for me. I hope you managed to get all of that. I'm not sure where I froze.
Thank you very much, Roshan. It was very interesting point of view indeed, and I was actually at the end of this presentations, I'm going to ask you some questions, and one of them is about self-determination. So I'm going to give the floor now to another brilliant speaker, Yuzuki Nagakoshi. Welcome again, Yuzuki. she's attorney at law. She spoke about the possible impact of ISIS's initial involvement in the conflict and Armenia's joining the International Criminal Court. And it's quite topical because on October 3, they joined the International Criminal Court with the hope and quest of individual responsibilities for these war crimes, which allegedly have happened on this disputed land. So, Yusuke, you can start your presentation. We are very interested to listen to you. Can you hear? Can you?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes, I can. Yes. So, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I would like to speak about the possible impact of the ICC's involvement in the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. Now, some of you have already heard part one of my presentation before the September incident happened, but I have completely revised my slides, so hopefully you will not be too bored. And so firstly, as was already discussed, Armenian lawmakers ratified the Rome Statute, so the Rome Statute will come into effect 60 days after the ratification date, so it will come into effect vis-a-vis Armenia by the end of this year. And according to a press release by the Armenian government, Armenia intends to retroactively recognize the ICC's jurisdiction from May 12th, 2021. So the first question would be over what crimes and in which territory would the ICC have jurisdiction over? So the first question is jurisdiction. So because Azerbaijan is not an ICC member state, in terms of the current Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, crimes at least partly committed in Armenia or by Armenian individuals will be subject to ICC jurisdiction. And the key is the word in Armenia. So please hold on to that thought a little bit. And in terms of Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan is not an ICC member state, crimes committed in Azerbaijan or internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan are not subject to ICC's jurisdiction unless they are committed by Armenians or nationals of other ICC member states. So Nagorno-Karabakh is internationally recognized as Azeri territory. Crimes committed in Nagorno-Karabakh by Azeri individuals are not subject to ICC jurisdiction. But when we look at it, it's not such a simple situation here because the ICC has an interesting jurisprudence developed in the Rohingya crisis and the Bangladesh-Myanmar situation. And in the decision, it says, for a crime to be considered to have taken place in a state party, at least one legal element of a crime, only one legal element of a crime within the jurisdiction of the court or part of such a crime must be committed on the territory of a state party, which means that, and the situation in the Bangladesh-Myanmar situation was as follows. Now I would have to simplify this, so forgive me if something is slightly incorrect in the details, but to simplify the situation, the Myanmar military committed grave violations of human rights. They burned the villages, they raped all the women, and everybody fled to Bangladesh. It has happened multiple times, and every time the Rohingya flees to Bangladesh, or they stay in the IDP camps, but most of them, many of them at least, flee to Bangladesh. And because, so Myanmar is not a member state, Bangladesh is a member state. So the ICC said, well, the crime of deportation is concluded only when the refugees cross the border from Myanmar to Bangladesh. So one element of the crime is satisfied in Bangladesh, right? So that is how they, and the situation here is quite close to what is happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now the situation is different in some important ways. For example, the Myanmar government has repeatedly said that the Rohingyas are illegal immigrants. They are Bengalis, meaning that they are from Bangladesh. So it seems like the intent of shooing them away to Bangladesh or returning them to their native place, in the words of the Myanmar government, this is not my words, it is my understanding that the Rohingya population are Burmese citizens, very clearly, according to the law. But in the Burmese government or the military's mind, they are Bangladeshi citizens, right? So it is the intent to cleanse the entire area of the Rohingya seems clear. And now, in terms of the current situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, at least ostensibly, the Azeri government is saying, oh, you should stay. We will treat you as citizens. So the situation is slightly different. But also we could infer that from the blockade and also from the previous conflicts and the way that the attack on the territory occurred in September, I think it is reasonable. I mean, I do not know the entire situation, but it seems reasonable to say that they fled, and they did not leave on their own volition. They were afraid that something bad would happen to them. So I think that could be fair to say. So so the jurisdiction situation. So with the precedent, the ICC precedent from Bangladesh, Myanmar, it is possible that certain crimes committed within Nagorno-Karabakh could come under ICC jurisdiction because of the cross-border element. So the Rohingya decision is a pretrial chamber decision, and it's only jurisdictional. And we still don't know whether other crimes with the cross-border element could fall under the ICC jurisdiction as well. The crime of deportation is a crime with an element that must necessarily be committed abroad because it's deportation. You have to go from state A to state B. But other crimes, for example, could also be committed, or the effects of a crime could be felt in a member state, although the direct act is taken in a non-member state. For example, the crime of genocide. If you take measures intended to prevent births, that could take place, that would have an effect in a place where they fled. Now, would and I think it is internationally recognized that a place where the effect is felt, the state where the effects are felt could exercise jurisdiction over the crime, even if the action did not take place in the jurisdiction. So I just kind of went into a little bit down a rabbit hole, so I'll stop here. But I think that it is possible that at least for certain crimes, the ICC would have the jurisdiction to investigate. So I'll talk briefly about admissibility. So in terms of admissibility, a very interesting aspect is that if there's a principle of complementarity, so if a member state or a non-member state, for that matter, genuinely investigates and prosecute, if necessary, cases of Rome Statute violations, then such investigations would render the case inadmissible before the ICC. So I suspect that domestic investigations on both sides would happen to trigger complementarity. And I hope that happens because even though there are always bad actors in any country, and there are, even if they mean well, sometimes people go beyond what is strictly permissible under the law. And I think the information concerning the situation on the ground is too scarce at the moment, and there are a lot of conflicting information, so I don't want to draw any conclusions. But it is important internationally to have domestic investigations to have a good image, and if you investigate and if there's nothing, that's great. So, and if there is something and if a proper investigation is taken, investigation is conducted and measures are taken, then that would trigger complementarity. So I assume that investigations would happen, or I hope that investigations would happen on both sides. So now, before I wrap up, what could happen at the ICC? So first of all, Armenia could refer the situation to the ICC, or the prosecutor initiates an investigation himself. And then the prosecutor conducts a preliminary examination. And if he believes that there's a reasonable basis to proceed with a formal investigation, the prosecutor submits a request of authorization to the pretrial chamber, and the pretrial chamber would authorize the commencement of an investigation. So this would take some time. So Armenia is just at the start of this process. So to conclude, there are possible or foreseeable long-term impact of ICC involvement. So possible domestic investigations and prosecutions to avoid ICC scrutiny. And as a side note, if it is not genuine, if it's not considered genuine, then ICC scrutiny cannot be avoided. So it is up to the domestic authorities and their rigor whether it would actually be triggered. And then there will be possible deterrence effect on both sides, because if I have read on multiple articles about the Azeri government might possible interest into crossing the border into Armenia. Now that would be deterred because Armenia, if they commit crimes in Armenia, then obviously that would fall under the scope of the ICC, regardless of who commits it. And in terms of Armenians, also, if they were to commit any war crimes, that would come under the ICC jurisdiction. So Armenia has committed not to commit war crimes, and I think that would have a deterrence effect as well in terms of the escalation of the conflict. And obviously, Armenia, through joining the ICC, is further approaching the West and distancing itself from Russia. So I think that is a trend that would continue. And obviously, if Mr. Putin enters Armenia, Armenia has the responsibility to arrest. And last but not least, I have a little bit of worry about the peace talks, because the ICC prosecutors known to be quite rigid in terms of not allowing amnesty deals. So when they say you have to investigate and prosecute, that is quite a serious obligation. And when the Ugandan government first referred the case to the ICC, and they then later on said, would you be able to retract the arrest warrants? Mr. Ocampo said no. The then prosecutor said, no, we're not going to retract it. And then it is said that it has impacted the peace talks because they didn't want to come over and sign, because they feared, by they I mean the rebels feared that they might get arrested. So it is quite rigid. So so it is my worry, and I am sure that my colleagues here would be able to inform me of the situation better. But if if once an investigation starts, and especially if an arrest warrant is issued, and then you want people, high-level people, to have amnesty so that the two countries can move forward. I don't know whether that's the case, but I see some peace talks going on, so I thought that could be a possibility. Then that could be a little bit difficult, because amnesty would not constitute a genuine investigation or prosecution, so it will not kick the trigger, the complementarity principle. So that's all for me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion and hearing more from other colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yusuke. It was very interesting, and I really appreciate all so far what we have heard. Was very interesting. Your inputs were interesting, of course. And now we're going to give the floor to Dr. Sarah Babayan. These conflicts, well, I think that all kinds of conflicts have to be resolved, but there's resolution has to be done in a way that both parties are satisfied, and it's very difficult, especially in the cases where we have all the aspects which are rooted back like decades ago, or which have very strong historical backgrounds. So this is the most difficult part, how conflicts can be resolved in a way that the eruption of escalation of offensive from any part of these conflicts not be just only a matter of time. So we are going to listen to Dr. Sarah Babayan. She's negotiations expert, legal advisor, and conflict manager. We're going to listen to her as to what steps must be taken for peaceful resolution in a way that both parties don't have any grudge against each other. Very difficult. Okay, we are listening to you. The floor is yours, Sarah. Thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eka. Yeah, as you correctly said, it's a very hard task to say something to this topic, especially with regard to this conflict, I must say. I mean, I have been present to many conflicts, but this is especially complex because it has so many different attitudes from which side you can have a look at it. I mean, as such, we said avenues for a peaceful resolution. So the first question is, I would be a bit cautious with saying peaceful, because what is peace? Is peace not war, or is peace as we have it in our minds, like everything is nice and everyone is living in freedom? And so I think really we have to be a bit careful if we are talking about peace, because even everything what happened before 2020 was not peace from 1994 until 2016 and 2020. Just it was like this frozen conflict, yeah. So honestly to say, I mean, I thought about it the last 2 weeks. What can I say? And honestly, I don't know if there's really a peaceful solution. And I mean, if we are talking about peaceful settlements, are always, as we say, negotiation, good offices, mediation. And I mean, this is what we are doing in Armenia since, I mean, at least 4 years, yeah, and or 3 years, we can say. And the main problem, and as a negotiator and also as a mediator, you always ask not for the position of the state, the country, or the person. You always ask for the main interest. What is the motive? Why are you doing what you're doing? And I think this is the main problem here. So if we really say that the clear intention is the ethnic cleansing, and it is to make genocide in order to get rid of the Armenians, not just in Nagorno-Karabakh, but also as Armenia itself, we really have a big problem, because what do we want to negotiate about? You know, if we really assume this is the main intention. If we say, okay, we keep that beside, yeah, we say, okay, it's not just about, I really to say like killing the Armenians, doing what the Turkish people or Turkish population did in the First World War, but we say, as Sheila correctly said, we have a very terrible geopolitical position because we are embedded in between these countries. So we are really, it could be sometimes, I think, it doesn't matter if we are Armenians or if we call each other French population or Spanish. In the end, we are in the middle of something which shouldn't be there from their perspective. So the question is, what shall we do? I mean, once again, there was this. We had 2 terrible international law violations in these attacks. They starved the population, even though Armenia tried to come a bit closer to Azerbaijan and saying, okay, in order to say your sovereignty is yours, we accept that. We say Nagorno-Karabakh is in it. And afterwards, what has happened? What has happened? You know, it was the blockade. And then it was even, I mean, they said it was like students doing this, then they installed the checkpoint. I mean, everything what Azerbaijan is doing since 2020 is contrary to international law, to international human rights law, to thousands of, or not thousands, but I don't know how many international covenants. I mean, everything they are doing is showing we do not confer to what is internationally asked for. Even if the International Court of Justice the highest court in the world of the United Nations orders something, Azerbaijan says no. I mean, this is something I would say, yeah? And why are they doing this? Because as we always know, we have no sanction mechanism, yeah? And they know, okay, step by step, we are going and we are always looking, what can we do without getting sanctioned? It's a bit the same like what Russia did. So the question is a bit, how shall we negotiate? I talked to someone from the foreign ministry of Armenia, and he talked to me and I said, you know, sometimes I don't understand how do you negotiate? And they said, you know, we say A, Azerbaijan says B. We say A plus, Azerbaijan says B. We say A plus plus, Azerbaijan says B. So Azerbaijan is really not moving at all because they just have one thing in their mind. So it is very hard to negotiate with someone who doesn't really want to negotiate because they think they are so powerful and they have so much might that in the end it doesn't matter. So what is the proposal? I mean, I really don't have a solution. And as you correctly said or have written, it's more like having avenues, or I called it scenarios. So just to start with one scenario, which is very terrible and which I hope will never be implemented, could be, and that's really the worst one, to say, okay, now nearly everyone has fled. I mean, over 100,000 people have already gone to Armenia. They have left the country. They have left Nagorno-Karabakh. And of course, everyone is totally afraid to go back because of what has happened and because there is no trust at all. So we could say, okay, you know what? We just hands up, we give up. And we stay there, we try everything to integrate the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia. And we just leave that beside. In the end, what we are doing, we just will try to secure Armenia as a republic, the sovereignty of Armenia, because as we know, they do not stop here. So really, I mean, there was just a meeting at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And you know what the Azerbaijani delegates say? They call Armenia Western Azerbaijan. This is just 2-3 days ago. This is what are we dealing with, yeah? So really, this could be an option to say, you know what, we just give up. Of course, we don't do this, but I just say it could be a way. So the second scenario could be to also refer back to you and talking about self-determination, really to try to apply and implement the internal right to self-determination, not succession, because we already know this won't happen, not because we don't have the right. I'm 100% sure that we have the right because of everything what has happened, and not just the last 4 years. I'm talking about exactly what Sheila said, from 1921 until 1994. So really everything what has happened, there was a reason why Armenia said, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh said, we want to split, we want to go to Armenia, we want to be part of Armenia. Why? Because already during this time, during these 60 years, where we had this autonomy, which they never really had, yeah, they were discriminated, churches were burned. I mean, everything, like they were not allowed to talk their language, like minority rights, nothing. That's the reason. I mean, if they would have granted internal self-determination, maybe Nagorno-Karabakh would have said, okay, that's who we are in this area of Azerbaijan, but that's okay. But because this hasn't happened, there was this big will to say, okay, we have to succeed. So we could try to do this, of course, with the pressure of the European Union, of the US, of other international actors who really have power to assert pressure on Azerbaijan. They could, if they would like to do this. Yeah, just to say that it's not that they are all powerless. They are not. And it should be in the interest, talking about geopolitical aspects, for the other states to see what will happen If we have this, what you already said, the Zangezur corridor, if this really is established, if we have this, how it's also called, this middle corridor, so really pan-Turkism, which comes together again, this could be even a higher goal and intention than just killing the Armenians. So we really have to see, what do you want, and can we give you something of this? Or do we really have to say, no, this is not possible at all? And then we have to really come up with what yesterday also the legal advisor of Armenia for international matters, Yelishe Kirakosyan, said in front of the ICJ. I mean, Azerbaijan has to eliminate all the military in the occupied territory. They have to guarantee that the Armenians can go back. They have to stop making this cultural genocide. I mean, all these things, we can say that. And of course, we have to have an independent monitoring mechanism. Yeah, not Russia who's doing anything, not Turkey who's doing anything, not Iran who's doing anything. That's insane. Yeah, you cannot put these states and say they want to mediate. Yeah, that's really a bad joke. So this could be also an opportunity, but this is only applicable or only implementable through the through asserting pressure on Azerbaijan. And then the last thing we could say, I mean, this is really like in a dream world, yeah, talking about reconciliation. Because, I mean, this is what makes peace in the end, to say, okay, kind of really easily speaking, we are sorry. We are sorry for what we did to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan goes to Armenia, says we are sorry what we did. Turkey would be the nicest thing, goes to Armenia. But of course, we know that this won't happen. So honestly to say, the conclusion is, I'm pretty sure that right at this point, there is no real peaceful resolution. Because also when we talk, and this was totally correct what you also said, Yuzuki, about peace versus justice. You know, if we say peace, and then Armenia is always going in front of courts, in front of the ICC, in front of the ICJ, the European Court for Human Rights, what will Azerbaijan say? Even if they are 100% right, but they will say, you're fighting us all the time. So we also have this. So in the end, it is really, I mean, as I said in the beginning, it is really so complex. And yeah, if we are talking about peace, like it's written in a textbook, I would say that's not possible now. I mean, we have to think for longer term, that's true. And I think we all try everything to make the best of all these negotiations. But once again, if we don't know really the intention, and if the intention is to destroy the Armenians, what they already did, then I would say it's really tough to have a real, honest, peaceful resolution.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was very interesting, very thought-provocative. So, wonderful speakers. I want to thank you very much for all of your insights which you shared today. And because today in this panel, we were talking only on the Armenian side. I want to ask you questions from the side of Azerbaijan too, because we know that all types of conflicts have both their arguments. So, for example, we know that this disputed land, Nagorno-Karabakh, with its surrounding territories, are internationally recognized, and it is legitimately assigned to Azerbaijan. This is international legal order, right? And over the decades, since 1992, Armenians forcefully entered to this territory. We remember the tragedy, which is called Khojaly tragedy. It was massacre. It was hundreds of people's killings, and then they started living there. And over this time, they say. So I just want to put this question in a way which would be very clear at the grassroots level for people who don't understand international public law, this jargon, but who are just sitting and probably will watch us later, or even now they are watching to us. And they say that this is our land. we are not recognizing this government. We are not recognizing international legal order. This is our territory. They started killing people. They started living there. So then the conflict started, then it got frozen. And then Azerbaijan, like after several years, when they found it the right time, they started to reclaim this territory. So what is the answer to this? For example, what is the legal ground for Armenians to say that historically we had been living there and now we have to like be given this territory back and we have to officially recognize this as our government? Or what is the answer to these questions to Azerbaijani side from Armenian side? They have this argument. This is our territory. You are disputing over our territory. What if in my apartment, somebody breaks into my apartment and takes the room, and after a month or years, they start disputing over this room, which is totally mine? What is the solution over this? I wanted to simplify this question, like in this particular example, like a very practical example. So anybody who wants to comment, I'm very eager to hear.
Can I start?
Yes, please, Sheila.
First, there isn't enough time to go through all the every single. We were talking about the root causes and the historical context. There was the conflation of saying something is mine. For Azerbaijan to say this is mine it's just so weird to me. This isn't a piece of property. This is a land on which people live. And so if we keep talking about this in terms of territory without thinking about the people who live on that territory, we always are going to come back to this problem. So the reason why Armenians did not, it's not that they said, this is my land. It's they said, we do not want to be part of Azerbaijan. Who says this is Azerbaijan? Who says I have to be ruled by these people who hate us? This is where it's coming from. And the answer to this struggle between, yes, Azerbaijan's position is that they have sovereignty and territorial integrity over that land. The Armenians' position, and not Armenia, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh say, well, we're sorry, you're not treating us well at all. You're treating us very, very badly. So we are going to block ourselves and defend ourselves from you hurting us anymore. That means then that Azerbaijan doesn't have access to that land. They want access to that land because they want to mine that land. They want access to that land because there's riches that they can extract from that land. That is, the concept of territorial integrity and sovereignty is to have access to the resources in that land. Mm-hmm. But they also have a responsibility to rule the people with fairness, dignity, and, that always gets lost in the mix. So this is where taking a human rights-based approach needs to start making sense. And this is a classic or perfect scenario or example where we see what happens when you don't take a human rights-based approach and a purely territorial approach to international law. I don't see where in the UN Charter the right of self-determination falls backwards to the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty. They are up there at the same place, okay? It's both in the preamble. I don't see when we decided that human rights didn't matter and that they were to take a second place after the concept of territorial integrity and sovereignty. There's a limit, okay? So this is the position of a human rights lawyer, not just an Armenian, but a human rights lawyer, that territorial integrity and sovereignty, according to me, is not absolute. They come with the limit that if you abuse that right, if you abuse that privilege, you lose that privilege. Now, there's a whole cohort, I know I fall in the minority when it comes to that, but there's a whole cohort of, first of all, leaders of states who say, no. I wonder why you would say no, because that doesn't serve your purposes of wanting total control to do whatever you want and put all that money in your own pocket. That's what we see all too often all over the world. But also, because that is the state practice, purist international lawyers who don't take a human rights approach, but take this pure approach, do harm. I think they do harm. They don't serve. I don't see what the purpose of international law is if it's not to serve all the people who are alive on the planet, as opposed to just leaders who want to benefit from the way the law is. So this is where the struggle lies. Yes, the law is predominantly on the part of territorial integrity and sovereignty being sacrosanct. They are, because the purpose of that is to prevent wars. The more we say, like, no, that's my land, we get wars going on. I understand why separatist movements are unpopular, but there has to be a space to allow for this possibility. Otherwise, you end up with situations of extreme persecution and ethnic cleansing that go unaccounted for, that are allowed because there's no other solution. So that's going to be my soapbox moment there.
And if
Thank you, Sheila.
Oh, sorry.
And yes, please, whoever wants to add some comments, I'm very interested to listen to.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I'm exactly with Sheila. And just to add something, and this is why
Yes,
I'm
please.
always really angry when we are talking about territorial integrity, and this is the only right, and sovereignty, and because, you know, there would be no, I mean, once again, there would be no possibility to succeed if you obey the internal self-determination. So if you say, okay, we have this minority, and the minority can do what they have to do in order to feel safe, to have their freedom, to have their rights, then there is not such a right of external self-determination in the meaning of we have to separate ourselves. This is not allowed. And this is what the law is. So that's why it's so crazy to always talk about no about self-determination, because if you grant these rights, there is not such a right to succeed. And this is something what I don't understand. So the fear of the states, that we have thousands of little states because everyone wants to succeed, it's not true. Because if you really have this harsh determination and analysis in the end, do we have human rights violations and so on and so on, and in the end we make a cut and we say no, because I mean, yeah, sometimes they don't feel good treated, but I mean, this is totally something else what has happened to the Armenians. So really that's I think, like, the fear is not even an objective one, because really it is, we don't have the right if they would obey. And even if they are talking about this is our sovereignty, even if we are just saying, okay, that's Azerbaijan, you cannot do on your ground whatever you want to just because this is your territory. You have thousands of contracts and covenants where you have to say, we have to see what the minority rights is. Also from the Council of Europe, they have the treaty, the agreement. So, I mean, even if we don't talk about international law, even nationally, they are going against this all the time. And I mean, if they already treat their people like, I don't know, I mean, violating all their rights, what do we expect for the Armenians? I'm sorry.
Right. Yes, very interesting. And another question, dear wonderful speakers. So, for example, we say that they have to protect the rights of these people who are living, the Armenians who are living there on this disputed land, and they do not recognize the government, Azerbaijani sovereignty of this land. They say that this is our land, we have our own government, and internationally they are called de facto republic, right? So if they are not even recognizing the government's sovereignty on the territory, which is internationally, again, assigned to this country. So how we're going to talk about the protection of their rights by the Azerbaijani government when they came there forcefully? Again, I'm talking now from the Azerbaijani side, right? So they came there from the 1990s forcefully. They started living there. They don't recognize the government of Azerbaijan.
They don't say that. They don't say that Armenians entered forcefully to live in Nagorno-Karabakh. I don't know where you're getting that.
In 1992, there was Hojali tragedy, right?
They recognize that Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh have been there for, like,
yes, Definitely. That had been there before. That's why they had this tragedy, which was mass killing in Khojaly. They always refer to this, for example. And when so to go back to this point, when they, from 1994, from the beginning of 1990s, when they started to recognize this territory as de facto republic, and they started not to recognize the sovereignty of Azerbaijan. How can we talk about Azerbaijani government's responsibility to protect their rights? This is, again, I'm talking from their point of view because I don't want to have discussion only on the one side. It does not necessarily express my viewpoint, but I want to ask you this question because these people have these questions. So yes, Roshan, we listen to you.
I want to point, please. So yes, no, I see what you're trying to say. You're saying it's very important to recognize the harms that have been done on both sides in relation to the conflict, in relation to the 90s and in the past as well. And certainly you reference in literature to Khojaly and what happened in Khojaly, and the evidence is disputed whether it was 161 people or 1,000 people that were killed, but it was probably one of the most single biggest events that happened during the conflict at that time. There was many other human rights violations committed throughout the conflict on all sides. There was displacement from Nagorno-Karabakh, but primarily from the surrounding regions, the other territories that had been occupied around Nagorno-Karabakh, which were a lot of the Azerbaijanis that were displaced came from. There was also many Azerbaijanis displaced from Armenia, and a lot of Armenians were displaced from Azerbaijan. So I think there's a lot more complex issues at play. And you saw in the media back in 2020 that people were saying, oh, well, you know, the Armenians that came in the 1980s or 90s into Nagorno-Karabakh, these people have been there for centuries and centuries, the Karabakh Armenians, as have the Azerbaijani population in the region. They were not the majority population. I think in terms of when we need to think about internal self-determination, if you cannot speak to the people that were the so-called de facto authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh about self-determination and whether there's any solution internally, because they weren't even directly speaking with one another. They were going to the government of Armenia to speak on behalf of these people, when it should have been speaking to the people themselves. Okay, what can we do in terms of internal self-determination, as opposed to saying, and what they were seeking was not to join Armenia, it was seeking independent statehood for themselves. Now, what I would say, though, is the threshold for remedial secession, if one can say it even exists, is extremely high. It's ethnic cleansing and it's genocide. Ironically, we might now talk about it, I believe, in the next, over what's happened in the last few weeks, but the population is no longer there, so I do not know what the solution is. But when we talk about peace building and peace agreements, we have to speak to each other, otherwise the result is use of force. And I do think there's a real danger now of the conflict now spreading beyond the borders of Azerbaijan itself. So anyway, just my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Roshan. I think that Sarah wants to add something, or no? Would you like to add something, Sarah? Okay, so one last question, dear speakers. What would you think could happen in like perfect world in this conflict? What would be the ideal outcome of this conflict if everyone is dealing with and handling this conflict with common sense, understanding people's rights, dignity, and all other factors? What would be the ideal outcome of this conflict? What do you think? You can start, whoever wants. So what
I'll
would be
keep
the,
it short. You know, the ideal outcome would be that the Armenians could return safely to Nagorno-Karabakh, and that there would be an environment or atmosphere that would be conducive to real reconciliation and coexistence. The reality is not that right now, because the regime, okay, there are two fundamentally diametrically opposed types of regimes. One is very autocratic, violent, and dictatorial. One is a burgeoning democracy. These are, and you know, one abides by a might is right principle. The other is has largely shifted towards abiding by the international rules-based order. So it's the conversations are different. It's like they're talking two different languages. So either Armenia has to become autocratic, dictatorial, and violent so that they can start speaking the same language, or the Aliyev regime has to fall and turn democratic. And, you know, we have to be sort of on the same wavelength. Otherwise, I don't see this going anywhere, unfortunately. Now, what's happened in Armenia since 2018 was something many people didn't expect could ever happen, but it's happened. So I always maintain hope that freedom is waiting for oppressed people, and the Azerbaijanis are an oppressed people. I'm sorry, they really are. So I hope that, you know, they can do whatever they need to do internally to get to a place where there can be a real conversation in this respect. I have no doubt that Armenians and Azerbaijanis can live in peace side by side. They are, you know, I've met Azerbaijanis, they are very good people and they want this conflict to end. But it's unfortunately when the leaders are making bad decisions and behaving in bad ways that everyone else suffers. But yeah, the ideal would be for there to be a viable chance of return, but it would have to be safe, and it's not right now. No matter what they say, it's just not true.
Wonderful. Wonderful speech, Sheila, and wonderful speech of all of you. We have only 5 minutes left. Yes, Yuzuki, please share your thought, and then we have to say bye to each other. Yes, please, Yuzuki.
Probably answering a little bit of the questions. And well, I am not Armenian, if you have not guessed from my name already. So I try to be neutral. And this is what I would say if I had an Azeri audience. I would say exactly the same thing. But so I come from a neutral standpoint, hopefully. But I think it's very important. I'm not saying that this is possible, but it is important to have a uniform narrative or something closer to that. Because if you have two different stories about the past, about what happened, about the history of the people and the region, it is very difficult to live together. So I'm just talking about the ideal status, but history actually, you can't have two different narratives about who did what and in order to live together. So there needs to be reconciliation based on accountability and also based on a joint search for a uniform narrative or similar narrative so that people could at least live together without looking at each other as enemies. And that kind of effort has to be undertaken by governments and also at the grassroots level. And I do agree that it is very difficult due to the political situation and also due to a lot of harm that is already done. So, but I do hope that accountability would actually result in justice, because historically that has, or peace, because that has not always been the case. So this is what I hope.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was, I think, very interesting discussion. I hope that, let's hope for the best. Let's be positive and optimistic, and let's stay in hope that everything will be all right. That's the very important thing. Have a wonderful day, wonderful weekend, and thank you again for coming here today and sharing your interesting thoughts. It was very interesting. Nice to have met you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.